they're small and they're in their little.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Wednesday, May 13th, 2020, Montgomery County Council meeting. The first item is, Madam Clerk, do we have any changes to our agenda?
Yes, good morning. Am I there? Yes. Good morning, Mr. President. We have a number of items. The Council has added point 5A to the consent calendar, introduction, special appropriation to the county government's FY20 operating budget, Montgomery County Economic Development Corporation, non-developmental account, support for COVID-19 response, $1,250,000 for telework assistance program. Source of funds, general fund reserves. The lead sponsor is the County Council. The public hearing action is tentatively scheduled for May 14th, 2020, or tomorrow. The Council has also deferred item 4, Executive Regulation 520, System Benefit Charges, Residential Waste Estimates. That is rescheduled for May 19th, 2020. The Council has added at 10:30 work session FY21 operating budget. Item 6, community grants and MCG cost sharing, supplement to community grants and cost sharing staff report. That was rescheduled from 5/12/2020. The new time, however, will be today at 1:30 p.m. Council has also added item 7, Legislative Branch Communications Outreach, NDA, Public Information Office, follow-up, and added item 8, Department of Environmental Protection, Recycling and Resource Management and Solid Waste Services Charges, follow-up. Council has also added number 9, Action, Renegotiated Collective Bargaining Agreements and Compensation for Benefits for Non-Represented Employees. And finally, the Council has added a proposed closed session at 2:30 to consult with counsel to obtain legal advice and to consult with staff, consultants, or other individuals about pending or potential litigation pursuant to Maryland Code General Provisions Article Section 3-305, subsections B7 and B8. Topic is pending suit against Montgomery County. That is all, President Katz.
Thank you very much, Madam Clerk. We now need a motion to approve our consent calendar, and Councilmember Friedson, would you like to make that motion?
So moved. Second.
It was moved, and who was the second? Was that Councilmember Reamer? All those, I see no comments. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And that is unanimous. Thank you very much. The next item that we have is item number 7, and that is the Legislative Branch Communications Outreach, the NDA Public Information Office follow-up, and I'm going to ask Ms. Michelson, I believe, to lead us off on that.
Yes, thank you, Council President. As you will recall, when the Council looked at its legislative branch NDA, it was very supportive of the need for an additional PIO to continue continuity of services, recognizing that the critical role this office played, not just for COVID-19, but on an ongoing basis. It asked me to explore whether there were any other PIO vacancies elsewhere in the executive branch, and there is, in fact, a vacant position at the same grade level that we had intended to hire within the county executive's PIO office. I'm told a decision was made to freeze that position as part of their current freeze efforts. And you will notice that the cost associated with that position is actually slightly more than the cost that we had anticipated. And that's because it was a filled position, so the cost there represents the salary of the departing staff person. When we budget for a new staff person, not knowing what their skills or their experience will be, we always budget at a midpoint level. So we had budgeted at close to $115,000, and the amount of the vacant position is $133,000. I'll turn it back to you for any discussion you may want to have or any action you might want to take.
Okay. Well, wait a minute. I evidently I skipped some things. We'll have to come back, but I have the council agenda in front of me. So, I have no speakers on this. Is there anyone that wants? Yes, Councilmember Navarro, please.
Thank you. Lost my Zoom there for a second. Thank you, Mr. President. As chair of this committee, I'm sure my committee members remember the extensive conversations that we have had, specifically last year, about the need for us to strengthen our communications office. We had discussed widely the fact that this is a council that represents 1 million residents. We have to make legislative decisions, land use decisions. We do constituent services. We do it for the entire county in multiple languages. And the advent of social media, et cetera, requires pretty much responses in real time and information in real time. And although our individual offices do great work in this space, the truth of the matter is that we don't have enough capacity to respond to everything. Now, that was last year before the pandemic hit. And even though we wanted to be proactive and we felt that it was important to strengthen our ability to respond, I think now it's become very clear to everybody how fundamental communications really is to the work that we do. In the past, the GO committee has had an opportunity to examine this issue, and we know that there are PIOs in a lot of different departments that are very specific to that subject matter. We know that there's also the PIO for the executive. I'm sure our staff has the breakdown of the numbers. And when you compare that to our office, which has to serve 9 different legislators, actually it is very clear that we are at a disadvantage, and that does not help the residents. I don't think that's what our residents expect. And so to me, this is a wise approach to at least to be able to strengthen our communications office. Just in case people are confused, we had a number of positions that had been included in the executive's budget that we are not adopting, we are not accepting, because we understand that we're dealing with the continuity of operations. This particular one is an attempt to actually be able to find a vacancy somewhere else so that we can do our work. And so I think that this is a wise approach, and would definitely like to move that we accept this particular recommendation from Ms. Michelson. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been moved. Is there a second? It's been seconded by Councilmember Friedson.
Wow.
Might I just note that, first off, I had skipped some areas and we're going to have to come back. But it's also my understanding, once we get past this, that there might be a difficulty with the YouTube feed this morning, so that may not be working. So our staff is working on that as well. Councilmember Glass.
And excuse me, can I just get
Yes.
Clarification? Councilmember Navarro, is your motion to add or to include this position in the council office budget, or does it relate to the executive's PIO position as well?
I think that what we had discussed, and Councilmember Friedson, who's the one who made this motion, what we discussed is that we were not going to take this up when it first came because we wanted you to identify a position elsewhere in the administration that then we could include in our communications office, which I think is what you described.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to make sure I was clear on what the motion was. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. Councilmember Glass, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank the GO chair for her leadership in this area, which began last year during her council presidency. And so I really do appreciate that. And also think the understanding of the reality that we are not creating a new position, but we want to repurpose an existing position is a very important distinction here. I appreciate Mr. Hudson joining us and to continue with some of the the thoughts that Councilmember Navarro had. Mr. Hudson, I just have a question or two. How many PIOs are there in the county?
PIOs in general, you mean between agencies as well as in our area?
That's right.
Let me see. There have been a couple that have been added on. If you count the police, fire, and some of the other agencies, there's approximately, and I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, probably approximately somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15.
Okay, 10 to 15 PIOs spread throughout our large government bureaucracy, and
Yes.
I appreciate that, and so with that number of PIOs, I'll say that I have been a little concerned, particularly during this crisis, that as has been noted, a number of council members, including my own office, have volunteered our own staff to help pitch in with the communication efforts, particularly with some of the language translation services and other things. And so I think that just underscores even more why this position is really important, because on top of all the constituent services that we are doing to make sure everyone is connected to life-saving and home-saving and health-saving resources, where we're doing translation services for the PIOs, which is important, but having somebody in-house to our communication team is equally as important to help relieve some of those efforts. So I am supportive of this motion, and thank you again, Councilmember Navarro, for your advocacy and leadership on this.
Thank you, Councilmember Friedson.
Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate Councilmember Navarro as well for her leadership on this, and just as much as her leadership on this particular issue, her willingness and the council's willingness to indulge and pursue this approach. I think it's really an important opportunity for us to reflect the fact that we've been working in a collaborative effort, but there are needs that the council has in order to be a partner in those collaborative efforts to communicate and work with the public, as we just heard earlier. And I think this is a reflection, as we have talked about before, that when it comes to the public and when it comes to services, residents don't think about reaching out to the council or to the county executive. They think about reaching out to the county. And we have to make sure that we are ready to respond and to communicate and to address not only this crisis, but all the various work that we do. And I think this is keeping with our efforts for continuity of service. We're not adding a new position. We're repurposing an existing position to reflect current realities and to make sure that we can keep up with doing the work that we are elected to do and that residents rightfully expect us to do. So appreciate this. I think that is a really good outcome, allows us to address the need in a way that reflects how we've approached every aspect of this budget. And I am personally grateful for the work that staff has done, and for the committee chair, and for the agreement with the executive branch and the PIO office to be able to work together with us in order to resolve this issue. So thank you, everybody, for that.
Thank you. First off, I do think it should be noted, it's my understanding that the YouTube feed is now back up working. And if I could ask for clarification, please, I guess of Mr. Hudson, it's 10 to 15 people plus the county executive's PIO office. Is that what you said?
That would be all of them. And when I say PIOs, I'm talking the PIOs in the police department, the PIOs in the fire department, and the ones who are sprinkled throughout the area. In the county executive's office proper, in terms of actual PIOs, you're talking, essentially 4 people, maybe, and with the additional position that you all were talking about, the 5th person. And those individuals are assigned departments. So we have PIOs who work with departments, and that is the structure that we have. Going into this coming fiscal year, we are actually looking at a reorganization and a restructuring to focus a lot more on social media and a couple of other things. And that is not something that we had been built for per se before. And with that in mind, that's what the repurposing of that position was actually going to be. And there was a lot of other restructuring that we were looking at prior to COVID-19. Obviously, after this pandemic, our office, in combination with your offices, will be very, very driven in terms of providing information and news to the residents of Montgomery County. I think that has been heightened. There's some, as the council member Navarro has mentioned on numerous occasions, there are some huge gaps in the way that we're structured as a county in terms of how we reach out to communities that are non-English speaking. And I would even add to that, communities that are not, I would call, atypical in touch with the government. And one of the things that we have begun to look at is, and I'm approaching my year anniversary, was going into next year having a structure that was a lot more aggressive in dealing with that, and that was even prior to COVID. So this position was key to us being able to head in that direction. Without that position now, obviously you all would have an additional person, but we would be down. We would be down an individual. So it will be a loss to our unit. It will be a loss to our growth. But it's something that we were really looking forward to beginning to kind of turn into the 21st century unit that we probably should be.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Auburn-Oz.
Thank you. So I think there's been a longstanding and continues to be a strong partnership between the council's PIO office and the executive branch PIO office. And I think that, the last 2 months have really demonstrated the value in the collaboration, particularly in the space and reaching our multicultural communities. That's where there has been, in the 12 years I've been in county government, unprecedented collaboration, to meet the demands of our population. And so I envision this as lifting all boats, and I very much support this motion, acknowledging that we are going to have to look more comprehensively, as it sounds like Mr. Hudson and his team are doing now, at how we reach our residents across the board, and to create a defined strategic plan that will help guide us moving forward. Because obviously I'm preaching to the choir, but the manner in which people receive their information has changed dramatically. The manner, it's a 24/7 operation now. It is not anywhere what it used to be. And then you add that to the layer of there's different tools and different methods within each of these different communication tools, and then the nuances of the unique needs of different multicultural communities. It's a complex issue. And so I think responsible in the way that we're doing this, but I do envision this continuing to be an alliance between our two incredible PIO offices, and look forward to a time where we can discuss a broader strategic plan, and then as we are able, implement it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll reluctantly support the motion. We are in a desperate situation here in the council as far as our communication staff, and Sonia Healy and Susan Kennedy and their whole teams need this badly. I would prefer not to rob Peter to pay Paul in this situation. I think the comments you made, Mr. Hudson, are important. There are limitations in what we do here as how we communicate. And to follow up on some points that have been made, this is an equity issue. There are people who are very well connected through our traditional modes of communication who get information quickly, act upon it, and benefit as a result. And we all know that that happens in our government. And what that means is that there are people who don't get the information, and they don't benefit, and they don't have access to the resources and services that they're entitled to as residents of the county. And we're seeing in this COVID era that literally can mean life and death, or health and safety being risked. If you don't know how to access testing, if you can't get information on rental assistance and you're not sure about where to go, and you don't know how to get the direct payments, it all has direct impact on your welfare. And so I think this is an area where we should have invested more. We should have kept the money and more money into the council office and not to have to done this trade of the position, because I agree the PIO office, while more well-resourced on the executive side, is not organized in a way to deliver the information that they need to deliver to all our diverse communities. So I hope that we can revisit this. I think it is a COVID-related expense, and we need to be beefing this up across all of government, because I agree with, I think Mr. Friedson made this point. People want to get a response from their county government, and we are unique in the council in that we are closest to the people in many ways, because they see us more, they touch us, we're the council, there's more of us, and when they come to us, they want help, and we need to be able to provide that, and the executive side needs to be able to work with us to provide that assistance. So I will support the motion, but I just wanted to be on record that this is an area in particular that we need to do more in on both sides of the street to make sure that we're serving all of our residents in an equitable way. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. And I'm not going to repeat everything that's been said, but I too am supporting this motion. Councilmember Rice.
So thank you very much, Mr. President. So Mr. Hudson, I hear you, and I think that, being on this council as one of the long-toothers who've seen some of the challenges when it comes to the coordination between the county executive and the county council, I've actually seen promise during this COVID-19 crisis. And so in a time in which when I first joined the council, I would think that the problem that you highlighted would be more concerning. But I really feel as though some of the work that's being done between Sonia Healy and your office and Julie and all have actually worked very well and synergetically. And so I don't see it as a loss. Wherever this position is actually going to be a plus as long as this position is dedicated to furthering the county. We have had all of our communications as the county, and we've been very clear about that. So I really believe as though this is a win for all of us, not a loss for anyone. I really do believe that our continued ability to be able to work on both sides of the street, to put out a message that is one Montgomery, is something that is incredibly important. And so from that perspective, I support this, and I look forward to continuing to bolster PIO in general, because I feel as though the biggest disconnect is in our communities of color and our communities of lower income and understanding government, as I know you do, Mr. Hudson. You come from a county who believed in that. And I know you had a county executive as your boss who believed in that. And so from that perspective, we are all there too. And we know that's what we need to do, and we can do it working together. And I pledge that although this decision may not be exactly in line with how you saw this moving forward, I think that there's light at the end of the tunnel, and it's actually a good potential for us to continue to foster that collaborative spirit. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you, colleagues. I'm glad to hear that you're also committed. I think it's important for me to put a plug for the work we did last year with the NAPA report. Make sure that all of those recommendations are acted upon. I think that if we had actually acted upon some of them last year, then we would not be having this conversation, because we would have strengthened that particular office that needed it so much. Also, I think it's important to keep in mind that there are also support staff in the PIO offices, at the executive, as well as the departments. And so when you add those positions, it is clear that our own communications unit does not compare in terms of capacity. And so I'm glad to hear Mr. Hudson talk about some of the ideas and the plans that they have. I think that we can realize those as we move forward and we understand the fiscal reality. But there's also room to, realign, rethink, even within the existing capacity, to be more strategic in terms of how people receive information. So anyway, I know this has been a long conversation today about just, one position that is being transferred. But I would also agree that during this pandemic, we have had a really robust collaborative spirit, and that is what our residents expect of us. So I hope that we will continue that. And with that, I hope then we can just vote on this thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was is moved by Councilmember Navarro, seconded by Councilmember Friedson. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And that is unanimous. Thank you very much. Now, and I apologize for this, I went off of the addendum agenda rather than the agenda because the addendum seemed to be fairly long, and I picked up the wrong paper. So, colleagues, we are now going to go all the way back to number 1, and that's a resolution to establish FY21 solid waste service charges. I'm going to turn to Vice President Hucker for the beginning of this.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, we all have a lot of tabs open these days. The resolution on the solid waste service charges, you all recall that the executive transmitted his solid waste charges back in March with the budget. They are approved annually by the council by resolution. There are some variances in the table on page 9. Let me turn it over to Mr. Levchenko to describe his packet. Thank you, Keith.
Basically, as Council Vice President Hucker mentioned, we get these charges in conjunction with the recommended budget in March. This year, because the council made some reductions within the solid waste disposal fund and collection fund, and also we have some additional assumptions built in terms of revenues. Staff has presented a revised set of charges. They're slightly in net, slightly below what the executive had recommended, which you would expect given that we made some modest reductions in these funds. In the reference on page 9 of the packet, you can see the executive's recommended numbers, and then you can see the revised numbers that staff is recommending based on consultation with executive staff. So council staff recommends that you go with the revised numbers. They're just a bit more accurate, and in a regular year, if the numbers were a little smaller, we might not make the adjustments. But given we had the opportunity to reflect these changes and some revised assumptions overall in the budget, it made sense to present the slightly lower numbers this year. If councilors have any specific questions, I'd be happy to answer those in terms of the reductions that the council made back on May 7th, or any other questions they might have about the charges.
Council Vice President, any other?
I have nothing else to add, so I move the staff recommendation.
It's been moved by Council Vice President Hucker. Is there a second? It has been seconded by Councilmember Reamer. All those in favor, please raise your, let me just make sure I don't have any speakers here. All those in favor, please raise your hand, and that carries unanimously. Thank you very much. Next is item number 2, and that's also Vice President Hucker on the FY21 water quality protection charge.
Thank you, Mr. President. My colleagues will recall our water quality protection charge has been a very successful program that's the backbone of our stormwater management efforts. It's been in place for 20 years. Every year we're required to set the residential unit charge prior to approving the final budget. This is this year's resolution to do just that. Good news is Mr. Levchenko is recommending 50 cents lower than the county executive recommend. With that, I will turn it over to Mr. Levchenko.
Okay, having a little trouble with the video, but I'll just mention, similarly with the solid waste charges, the council made some reductions in the water quality protection fund budget. Those are reflected basically in the reduced charge that Council Vice President Hucker mentioned. Basically, the changes were those continuity of service changes that the council's been going through in terms of compensation and some other new or enhanced programs that were trimmed as part of this. So the water quality protection charge could be trimmed a little bit in conjunction with that. So staff recommends the slightly lower ERU rate, which is technically what you're approving, which then flows into the charges, literally, that people pay each year.
Thank you. Council Vice President, anything else?
I have nothing else. I move the staff recommendation.
It's been moved by Council Vice President Hucker. Is there a second? It's been seconded by Councilmember Reamer. All those in favor, please raise your hand, and that carries unanimously. Thank you very much.
And I know we were joined by some DEP staff, and I know we're all grateful for their hard work on this.
Okay, thank you. And yes, we see some names there. The third item is also Council Vice President Hucker on the WSSC Systems Development Charge.
Yes, sir. This, of course, is the system development charge, not directly paid by our constituents. It's paid by developers who propose new developments, and it allows WSSC to collect this charge to pay for the build out of their infrastructure. It changes slightly every year. It is set by the council at the time we pass the budget. And Mr. Levchenko, again, has prepared a very good packet, so I'll let him elaborate on this year's changes.
And similar to past years, basically the process is already concluded. This is really just to formalize the process. The council discussed the charges during the development of the WSSC budget, and then at the bi-county meeting last week, both councils jointly approved a number of provisions, including the system development charge. This particular charge would remain unchanged this year, although the maximum allowable rate under the state law would be allow the charge to go up an additional amount in the future. So that's included in the resolution as it has been in past years. But there's no overall change in the charge. And this is consistent with both councils' recent actions, so staff recommends approval.
Thank you. Council Vice President Hucker.
If there are no other speakers, Mr. President, I would move that we concur with our previous action and approve the system development charge for WSSC for this year.
Thank you. It's been moved by Council Vice President Hucker, seconded by Council Member Reamer. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And that carries unanimously as well. Thank you very much. Next, we're going to hear from the introduction suspension of rules action. Resolution to approve FY20 savings plan, and I believe Mr. Howard will be explaining that to us.
Yes, Mr. President, thank you very much. This is just formalizing the OPEB savings plan that the county executive submitted along with his operating budget to reduce the county government's OPEB pre-funding by $21.1 million based on an updated actuarial evaluation. The council reviewed this and indicated its tentative approval as part of its straw vote on the compensation and benefit items that were outside of the collective bargaining agreements. And this resolution would just formalize the savings plan.
Thank you. Councilmember Navarro is the chair of GO. Could you please discuss this with us?
Well, I think Mr. Howard just did that. But as the chair who usually introduces these items, I think that he, has already describe what we're supposed to do here. Obviously, we didn't indicate our intent already on May 5th, and he has explained that this is something that the executive has included in his budget, but we had an opportunity to discuss, and we took a straw vote. So we changed the order here, but Mr. Howard, you did an amazing job.
Well, he does, even if we kept the order correctly. But anyhow, Councilmember Friedson, please.
Yeah, I just briefly appreciate the leadership that the Government Operations Committee has shown and commitment to looking at all of our fiscal policies. We were going to have a significant work session with a lot of work that had come together from staff to look at how these major changes had occurred. There's some significant calculation and assumption changes that dramatically shifted the cost to obligation. We didn't have a chance to dive into those details. I think it's a really significant and important public conversation that we need to have. Look forward to having it once we get through this crisis and working together with the executive branch to make sure that the council is aware of what these assumptions are, how they get made, and to ensure that the commitments that we've made are commitments that we intend to keep and that we are funding the obligations that we have moving forward for public health care in terms of fiscal sustainability and in terms of the healthcare obligations that we have offered to our employees. So thank you for that. Look forward to it. It's an ongoing discussion and one I look forward to having and working on behalf.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Navarro, did you have a motion? This is an action item.
So moved.
It's been moved by Councilmember Navarro, seconded by Councilmember Reamer.
I believe you need to suspend the rules first, Mr. President.
So we don't vote to suspend the rules?
Right. I think that needs to be the first motion to suspend the rules, then vote to.
Okay, yeah, all right. So this is your motion, Councilmember Navarro, to suspend the rules?
I move to suspend the rules.
And seconded by Councilmember Reamer to suspend the rules. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, it carries unanimously. And then
I move the staff recommendation.
it's been moved by Councilmember Navarro, seconded by Councilmember Reamer. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And that carries unanimously as well. Okay. And Mr. Howard, we're now complete on this, is that correct?
You are complete.
Okay. Well, because I was so efficient, that was number 5. We've already 7. I just want you to know how efficient I am. Now, we're now going all the way to number 8, which is the Department of Environmental Protection, Recycling and Resource Management, and Solid Waste Service Charges follow-up. Council Vice President Hucker, did you have anything to add on that? You're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, as already discussed in our straw vote, this is the Solid Waste Collection Fund budget. I don't think anything's changed. Mr. Levchenko, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just to note that when the council took their straw vote on May 7th, the council recommended approval of the collection fund budget as recommended by the council's staff. For the disposal fund budget, the council supported the council staff's continuity of services budget recommendation with one additional item, the additional field inspectors to reduce contamination. The reason I'm following up today is because there was an item that was inadvertently omitted that should have been included in the council staff report under the executive recommended items not included in the continuity of services section. This item included, the item was removed from my recommendation, but I had not explained it in the packet. So I felt that the council should at least have a full understanding of that. The item had to do with Wheaton recycling bins that the department was recommending to initiate in FY21. In coordination with the urban district managers, DEP's developed a staged plan to provide these new high-quality recycling bins. And in fact, they would be for both commingled and mixed paper materials. And they'd be distributed in the Bethesda, Silver Spring, and Wheaton urban districts. Starting in Wheaton, which is the smaller of the 3, and so it has a little bit of a smaller price tag up front. According to DEP, there are many areas in the urban districts that have trash containers but do not have nearby recycling containers, and this leads to a significant amount of recyclable materials ending up in the trash stream instead of the appropriate recycling stream. So DEP's plans for FY21, as proposed in the executive recommended budget, was to roll this program out in Wheaton first. The $78,000 would provide 52 high-quality outdoor quality bins throughout the Wheaton urban district, and then in future stages beyond FY21, they would begin to move these to the Bethesda and Silver Spring districts. Now, similar to other issues in the DEP budget, when staff looked at this, it is an enhancement and did not make it into staff's continuity of services budget, which the council straw voted last week. But I did want to bring this up just to note that this was not in the budget but had not been specifically explained. And we do have DP staff here if council members have any further questions regarding this. But staff's recommendation would actually remain the same, that it not be in the continuity of services budget at this time. But I did want to make sure that the council members were aware of this item in case they did want further consideration of it.
Okay. Councilmember Harper.
To me, this seems like a very worthy expense. I don't know if Councilmember Navarro has anything to add, but I know there's quite a need for this. We're all supportive of the changes in Wheaton and increasing our recycling percentages, which have lagged a little bit. And I've long thought we need these type of bins in Bethesda and Silver Spring, so I'm glad the program is envisioned to be expanded.
Thank you, Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Council Member Hucker, Chair of the committee. I would agree. I think that as we have done with some other items regarding the Wheaton urban district, and because of the revitalization project about to totally be wrapped up, this is a very important component. The idea is for us to make sure that we put in place all the necessary ingredients for a successful revitalization project. This seems like a very small amount to invest to further our goals of recycling and environmental stewardship. Here we have an amazing building with extraordinary environmental features. This just makes a lot of sense. So I would like to move that we actually include this item.
Second. It's been moved by Councilmember Navarro and seconded by Vice President Hucker. Councilmember Reamer, please.
Thanks. Just wanted to understand, is there a correlation between the positions that we authorized, related to improving the accuracy, which we thought would be essentially cost neutral ideally, and these bins? Is this part of that program as well? And secondly, just to be more specific, so these bins are they for multifamily buildings? Are these outside of restaurants? What's the who actually uses these bins? What kind of bins are they? Are they really large bins for buildings, or are these, those bins that we're sort of familiar with from our own individual properties?
Well, let me start, and then we do have DEP folks here that can give more detail. These would be exterior quality bins for pedestrians to use or anyone on the streetscape. So they're not intended as industrial bins for businesses. These would be bins that would collect mixed paper and commingled materials along the street or buildings. But they're very high quality. They're meant to survive, exterior conditions. In terms of the overall benefit is to reduce contamination in the waste stream. So certainly it's linked to a lot of other efforts that DEP is pursuing. The additional staff that the council straw voted last week would actually be following haulers on their routes as they pick up recycling and targeting those areas where there's particularly high contamination. The pilot efforts they've done to date show that has an extremely good success rate. So that's more on the residential side. This is more trying to reduce the contamination in the urban districts in particular. So the programs are obviously working towards the same goal, but they're not directly linked in terms of you have to do one to do the other.
Got it. And then Silver Spring and Bethesda would follow. Is that for next year, not this coming year?
Well, I can let DEP speak to that. There's nothing in the budget for FY21 for that. Those are much bigger areas, so the numbers would be bigger for those to do an equivalent, reach in those areas. So we don't have that before us today, but DEP folks are here that can speak to that.
Mr. Ortiz, would you like to speak?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President, and good morning to everybody. It's a pleasure to see you all again. Wheaton was chosen because of the smaller size, because of aligning our move as a government to that area, but also Silver Spring, Bethesda, and forgive me. We all have private partners in those areas that are also willing to co-fund. So in second and third phases, we were interested in partnering with the local businesses there to help fund. Wheaton, there aren't quite as many business partners with the deep pockets, and we wanted to get out of the gate right away. I also wanted to add, and Mr. Levchenko did a great job as always, that without having recycling containers side by side with trash containers, the county is actually in violation of our own laws that require recycling bins to be accessible and adjacent to trash cans. So, the downtown areas, the urban districts are Montgomery's main streets, and it's really important, we think, that we begin to practice what we preach in a highly visible public way.
Thanks.
Okay. Councilmember Friedson.
Yeah, just very quickly, thank you, Director Ortiz, for the comments specifically about being in violation of our own laws. I think I've said a lot that we should lead by the power of our example, not necessarily just the example of our power. And I think this would be an example of that. We talked about things that our laws require being part of this budget discussion, so I appreciate you bringing that forward. Full disclosure, I am on the board of Bethesda Green, but I just want to raise the efforts. I know you have worked, the department has worked with them before with their local organizations, Bethesda Green and Bethesda as an example of not just private business that you mentioned, efforts, but nonprofit and advocacy efforts to really boost our recycling in different communities, particularly in Bethesda and Silver Spring and some of the urban areas. And I would hope that as we move forward, perhaps we could accelerate the efforts by leveraging those private and nonprofit partnerships to be able to move this forward as quickly as possible. I'd love to see a more comprehensive effort in Wheaton and beyond in FY21 with as few public resources as possible, given the importance of the project. So I just wanted to raise that.
Yeah, so noted. Thank you, Mr. Friedson.
Thank you. I have no other speakers. It's been moved by Council Member Navarro, seconded by Council Vice President Hucker. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And that is unanimous. Thank you very much. The next item is item number 9, which is an action item. It's the renegotiated collective bargaining agreements and compensation and benefits for non-represented employees. And we're going to turn to Councilmember Navarro, who's the Chair of Government Operations.
Thank you, Mr. President. So on April 24th, Council President and myself had a preliminary conversation with County Executive Elrich regarding how to proceed with the negotiated agreements. We expressed our concern because as we have been proceeding with the continuity of operations framework for our budget, we wanted to at least begin a conversation about whether there was a possibility that we could not entertain particular increases right now, and then leave the door open for further conversation once we understood the impact of the fiscal reality given the COVID-19 situation. We had that conversation, but nothing really came out of that initial conversation. So we had to move ahead and vote to reject the agreements, which then triggered the 9-day period for renegotiation. The council asked me to also meet with the unions in order to communicate the council's position. I held that meeting on April 24th. I was instructed that my job was to come and explain the position of the council with regards to this particular set of agreements, and then we would take it from there and see where we could end up. I want to share publicly what I discussed in representing my colleagues on the council, which of course I've shared this with my council colleagues, but just for the record, I started by expressing our understanding that these agreements were negotiated before the COVID-19 pandemic hit us. I express our appreciation for the resiliency of our employees as they are providing assistance to residents who have been hit very hard by this unprecedented crisis. We also are pleased that there was an agreement reached for hazard pay for our front-facing and not non-front-facing employees. And we understand that pay, hazard pay may amount to $20 million if it's provided through the rest of FY20. We also, I also expressed that the bottom line here is that no one can truly predict the magnitude of the human and fiscal impact of this pandemic. I also shared that our finance department has shared with us the fact that they estimate revenue losses between $100 million to $6 million, and also that for the first time they are applying for a line of credit of $300 million, which is a prudent approach to a situation of this magnitude with such unprecedented characteristics. I also shared that we are doing our best to mitigate the impact on our most vulnerable residents, vulnerable small businesses, but that it has been very clear that many small businesses may not survive this, that there are many jobs that may not come back, and that we also are aware that many of our most vulnerable residents will most likely be displaced. So the face of the county will change on many levels. On March 24th, our council unanimously adopted a resolution that affirmed our intent to pass the continuity of operations budget And in the clause, we did state that we would want to revisit some of the decisions that we're making right now in the future if the fiscal picture was enhanced. So to wrap up, I indicated the position of the council, which was to not vote for increases in wages and benefits at this time due to the unprecedented crises, that we were not closing the door on coming back once the situation hopefully becomes a lot clearer, but we cannot guarantee what we'll be able to do. We would have to work together. That was the extent of my message to our partners, our union leaders on that particular day, which was May 6th. At this time, I know that we have received negotiated agreements that were sent yesterday to us, transmitted yesterday, and I believe, is it Mr. Howard that's going to walk us through, or is it Mr. Drummer? I'm not sure, Mr. President, but I turn it over to you.
Thank you. I believe it is Mr. Drummer, but I'm not sure.
Good morning. Yeah, I can start, and Aaron Trumka, I believe, is here as well to go through some of the numbers. The council, as Ms. Navarro just stated, rejected the provisions in the collective bargaining agreements that require either money or a change in law. And the parties renegotiated the agreements, sent us renegotiated agreements yesterday, late yesterday. And they're in your packet. The actual revised agreements are in your packet today. There's also a chart starting on A3 that shows each of the provisions in the collective bargaining agreements, in the original agreements, and how they were changed in the new agreements. I'll say that the council now is at a point where you need to make a decision on how you're going to fund or not fund the contracts, and as well as compensation and benefits for non-represented employees are also before you today. The revised collective bargaining agreements only eliminated one provision, and that was in the McGeo agreement. I believe the 50 cents an hour for seasonal employees was eliminated. Everything else remains the same. The wage provisions were moved from whatever they were mostly towards the beginning of the fiscal year at different places for different employees, all moved to the last pay period of the fiscal year. As you know, that saves money this year, but not next year and the year after. It sets you up for the full brunt of the raises in following years. Mr. Trumka can go through, if you will, the actual changes in the provisions and the more importantly the cost, differences.
Thank you, Bob. So I'll just
original agreements.
Yeah. Thank you, Bob. I'm going to just take the council through the very high level. We're on page 3 of the staff packet, and just go by bargaining unit, some of the major changes. We'll start by talking about McGeo. For McGeo, with their general wage adjustments, the March agreement had a 1.25% GWA effective in July. The renegotiated agreement would defer that until June 2021. The service increment at 3.5%, the FY11 service increment of 1.25% for employees who did not receive an increment in FY11, a lump sum payment of $1,000 for certain employees, and longevity adjustments. All of those are unchanged in the renegotiated agreements compared to the March agreement. There are other various provisions in the McGeo agreement that Bob details in his packet. Just some of the ones with the greatest fiscal impact. There was a proposal to have a retirement contribution shift where the county will pay 1% more of salary, employees would pay 1% less. In the renegotiated agreement, that stays in but is deferred from July 2020 to June 2021. Other provisions with significant fiscal impact that remain or retained in the McGeo agreement include a military service credit for sheriffs and correctional officers, a sick leave payout for our RSP and GRIP employees, and the creation of a new pension group for public safety and emergency communications specialists. On the bottom of page 3 of the packet is the table showing the changes for FOP. General wage adjustment, 1% in the March agreement effective in July of this year, renegotiated to the same 1% but effective in June 2021. Service increment of 3.5%, no change in the renegotiated. The salary schedule adjustment that was proposed at 3.5% in the March agreement is deferred at that same level to June 2021. And again, no change in the longevity adjustments. On the top of page 4 of the packet is the table for the IAFF. Again, with the general wage adjustment, 2.25% was in the March agreement, effective in August. The negotiated agreement defers that to June. Service increments of 3.5% and longevity adjustments, no change. Also note that although it wasn't part of the negotiated agreements, the executive's compensation recommendations include some for non-represented employees. It also defers the general wage adjustment. It would defer a contribution shift for retirement and would also defer a shift differential for non-represented employees from July to June 2021. On page 4, there's a paragraph that describes the cost. So as Bob mentioned, the delay of these, many of the provisions do have a significant impact in FY21 costs. So for the March agreement, the cost of all the compensation increases, including the pass-through for non-represented, in tax-supported dollars would have been $27.2 million. The renegotiated agreements reduced these down to 12.9, about $13 million. So that's the effect of delaying several of the changes, most notably the GWAs to the end of the fiscal year. But as we've discussed before, sustainability is not only about a single year, it's about the ability to afford the spending over time.
Aaron,
and so what we note is that the
can you pause for a second?
Yeah.
Are you showing something on a screen that you think we're seeing? I'm not seeing it.
Oh, okay.
Others are not seeing it either.
He's going through the memo.
I'm going through the packet.
You're going through the packet. You're not projecting anything into a screen.
No.
Okay, that's kind of what I thought, but I wasn't sure. Okay, thank you.
Do council members have if council members have the packet? If not, I can project it in a second. Just to conclude, the negotiated agreements have nil effect on the out years for FY22 and beyond, and that the cost of those both in March and in the renegotiated agreements would be about $30 million a year. And with that, I'll turn it back.
Okay. Thank you. I have no other speakers at this point. Is there a motion?
Wait.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead, please.
Are we doing all of the agreements at once? Please clarify.
Here again, that is what it on our agenda. We can certainly discuss that.
I want to clarify that.
Okay.
Do you want to describe the memo or the email we got 40 minutes ago from Madaleno or
Mr. Madaleno, did you want to explain the email that you sent?
Okay, they started my video, so I can explain. Sure. The county executive strongly believes that the renegotiated contracts are affordable for the county moving forward. As you heard from both Mr. Drummer and Mr. Trumka, the main drivers of additional cost are moved to the very end of the next fiscal year. we did this in trying to adjust within the law what we heard the council through your representative tell us on May 6th when we met with the council direction from Councilmember Navarro to try to give you the option to revisit the items within the current construct of our law. So all of the new provisions, the general wage adjustments, those things are delayed until the last pay period of FY20, which is which would be, of the FY21, which would be June 20th, 2021. It provides a trigger to revisit earlier the GWAs should our fiscal condition improve measurably from what our current thinking is. What the county executive did in order to demonstrate or potentially answer some of the concerns about the affordability, he is proposing several items which would, I think, provide room, more than enough room within the budget in order to make these affordable. First, he proposes a reduction in operating expenses, not personnel costs, but operating expenses for all executive departments equaling 5%. In essence, it is the approach that the county government has used over years for savings plans, and it would free up roughly $20 million of planned expenditures. You just had the little brief conversation about the Consolidated Retiree Health Benefit Trust and the contribution for FY20, and we think it's prudent for you to only budget half of the planned contribution. We do not make any transfer to OPEB to the trust fund until the very end of February, and that is only the first third. This is an administrative policy that's been in place since Mr. Firestein put it in 2013. So again, that is a decision that is put off every year well into the fiscal year, and our thought is why tie up all of those resources when, again, we don't know the situation. We will reduce 100 vacant positions and submit the list to you when you come back in June. We already have a hiring freeze in place and extended. The county executive would like us to, in fact, go through the other vacant positions and decide which ones will be permanently frozen without exception through October to provide an additional set of savings for FY21. And while we totally understand your desire to remove the so-called negative NDA for the reorganization, we will still move forward with the reorganization plan and provide to you an additional list of reductions for the council to consider. So that's the basic outlines of a fiscal plan. The county executive also wanted to make sure to note that he strongly believes, as do I think our partners with the labor organizations, that the service increments, while you can put on a chart what the cost of a service increment is, that in any year, because of the churn in employment, because of the number of people who depart almost always on the higher end of the pay scale and are replaced by newer people coming in on the bottom side, that that turnover pays more than pays for the service increment, and that without a service increment, which is sort of fundamental to public sector employment, because in the public sector, increasing productivity does not lead to increasing revenues per se, like in the private sector, where increasing productivity can lead to increasing profits for the company. That this is the ongoing mechanism that is used to reward employees for their continued growth in their jobs as they move up through the grade, the pay band that they are in. So when you put aside increments, and you certainly through your budget actions, in essence, you have already realized the savings, banked the savings from the turnover, that the other pieces of the contract that cost money are all put off to the end of the fiscal year, and thus are very affordable within the FY21 context, and it provides you the ability of what you wanted, which was the opportunity to come back during the fiscal year and revisit the various economic pieces of the contracts as we all learn more about our fiscal situation. So we could not find a way to just put off the contracts for 3 months, but we've created a system where we're calling it a trigger. After every quarterly review of expenditures and revenues, if we are in a position where we are our projected end of year balance is $20 million or more better than what we thought, the county executive would be required to send over to you a supplemental to move forward with the various negotiated salary enhancements.
Okay, thank you for that. I just wanted you to have a chance to share what this position was. I don't support many of the positions that you stated. I find the idea that steps don't cost the county budget to be contradicted by your own budget, which shows an increase of funding to pay for them. If they didn't cost us money, then you wouldn't have sent us a request to spend more money to fund them. I don't like the idea of rating OPEB, retiree health funds, to pay for this as we're heading into a storm.
We're not taking money out of OPEB to pay for this.
Well,
we would be reducing our contribution.
Reducing our contribution. I feel it's the same, but and I'm very concerned about the idea of cutting current services. Those are, we're talking HHS contracts, we're talking COVID response capacity, cutting that to fund something that we all know the next year's budget is going to be far worse than this year's budget. This is the FY21, and this is the high water mark likely for the next several years. FY22 could well be one of the worst budgets we've ever seen. FY23 might be similar. So, we're heading into very, very difficult times. I do appreciate, the effort to renegotiate, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Vice President Hucker.
Thank you, Mr. President. Glad we have Mr. Madaleno and Mr. Trumka. Thank you, as always, for this helpful packet. Just following up on Councilmember Reamer's point, this has always been a source of confusion to me. I understand the position that Mr. Madaleno was just explaining about the cost of service increments. But when you look at this year's packet, it has the cost of the service increment for bargaining 4.1 million and next year 7.6. But when you look at last year's packet, it has the cost from last year down to 4.1 million again. So those two numbers seem inconsistent and more supportive of Mr. Madaleno's position that we lose the higher end employees to retirement, attrition, other things, and that the cost, even though we say it's going to cost us money every year, in fact, it hasn't. Mr. Madaleno, am I saying this correctly?
I don't think you got that right. I mean, the increments come in on your anniversary in the middle of the year. And so you pay for a part of the year, the increments in year one, and you pay for all of it in year two. So whenever you do an increment, it's always going to be lower in the next year and higher the year after. That's why there's two different numbers, why it's annualized higher than it is for the first year. I mean, the numbers we got are not numbers we made up. They're numbers that came from OMB, for these things.
There is no question that you can determine, one can determine, and we do every year, look at what is the cost of, and I'm sorry to use, to be redundant, what is the incremental cost of the service increments for each employee, and then you can add those up and get a number. And that is what that number reflects. However, in total compensation, when you look at the amount of money spent on salaries from one year to the next, it tracks very closely, if not usually below, whatever the general wage adjustment is.
Right.
So, one way to look at it is the general wage adjustment is designed to provide all of our employees with an increase to cover any change in the cost of living so that they don't lose sort of buying power. The increment is what is given to our employees to demonstrate their work and growth within the position. Every year, a school nurse is on the job. He or she is learning more about the position, how to treat students, and ideally how to do it in a more productive way. The same holds true for a firefighter, a police officer, a social worker, a correctional officer. All of those people are learning by being on the job and dealing with their various responsibilities. So that's why the county executive agrees, and as one of your colleagues for the last 12 years agrees that service increments are a fundamental part of the basic small c contract between the public service employees and their public service employer, whether it's the Montgomery County government or the federal government or governments across the country. So that's why when you think of, in the context of, let's say, the police department, you have every year there are classes that come out of the academy, groups of police officers who stay for their career with the Montgomery County Police Department. When they retire, they are filled by someone making far, far less.
Right.
And that churn results in actually a savings in compensation. So if you're looking to see how the budget will change the total budget will change from one year to another, it's really that general wage adjustment that drives any additional cost. And so I know it's very confusing to talk about it, to show, we can show what the change in cost or this set of employees will be for next year. But in the overall context of the county budget, service increments actually do not cost additional expenditures.
Mr. President?
Could I just answer that? OLO, when we did it was probably about 7 or 8 years ago, and there was a proposed retirement incentive program where the executive was going to pay people to leave, and it was going to be savings. Cheaper people would come in. Because you're paying retirement benefits and health insurance for 2 employees instead of 1, it doesn't actually save you money. Just when new people come in, I don't think you're looking at the whole picture when you do that.
Well, certainly from early retirement and people who are in the old retirement system, there is a lingering cost when you're doing the early buyout, as opposed to the natural churn that occurs in any year without let's say, an incentive to retire.
Right.
Mr. President, may I address the issue?
I think I have a series of questions, Aaron. Thanks. Mr. Madaleno they're very helpful. This is explained every year, and every year you guys push back, and we have the numbers from OMB that say the actual cost is closer to the general wage agreement of 4.1 million. So, I mean, I don't know. I know we sort of have to move on. Mr. Madaleno, I'm glad you're here. Do you? I don't know the answer to this. Is the lapse, the savings through lapse in each unit included in the budget projections? I know we've had a severe problem with recruitment and retention. I understand it's over 3 million in savings just in police alone. Is that reflected?
So yes, the lapse. I mean, the budgeted lapse is in the budget. It is reflected in the budget. So there is a planned lapse, and then there is additional turnover that occurs during the year as positions become vacant. So I think the way to look at it is lapse is targeted to what we assume will be the turnover, and then there's always turnover beyond that, since the department does not have the authority to fill positions that would have them go over their budgeted personnel costs.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Sorry, I couldn't hear what you said.
I have a couple questions for some of the stakeholders that I think have joined us. Is Mr. Buttle here from the firefighters?
That's correct, Councilmember.
Jeff, are you there?
Yes, correct. I'm here.
Okay, I'm glad. I would benefit from you being able to shed light a little bit on this discussion. I mean, as you know, the goal here isn't just to have the lowest possible budget. Anybody can cut a budget without a lot of intelligence, but it's to have a motivated and a successful workforce that can get the job done. And I know Mr. President, in our Public Safety Committee, every year we have, under the best of times, in a historic economic expansion, we've had severe problems with recruitment and retention, both particularly of our firefighters, of our police, our school nurses. So, Mr. Buttle, what is your reaction to the current climate? Can you comment on the morale of our firefighters and how they will look at the actions we take today?
Well, I think, a couple things, Council Member. One, our firefighters and paramedics who are out there on the front lines are under an extraordinary amount of stress right now, as you can imagine, dealing with this global pandemic and public health crisis. And I think in context, what has to be, considered is some of the things from past years that have not been funded, mainly that 3.5% service increment from FY13, which is why we kept the service increment in the revised agreements intact. We have about 354 employees who are still due that FY13 increment. And if the council chooses to not fund that again this year, it would set those employees back 2 increments instead of just the one that they're already behind because it wasn't previously funded. And I'm afraid that, that action, if that's what ends up taking place, to not fund those, would have a catastrophic effect on morale that would be generational and would just last for years to come, particularly considering, the stressful working conditions that our members are operating under right now out in the field, responding to calls and serving the citizens during the middle of this crisis.
Thank you. Is Mr. Cook here from the police? Tori? Mr. Cook?
This is Lee Holland, the corporate vice president.
Great. Thank you for joining us. This is an issue we spend hours talking about in Public Safety Committee under normal circumstances every year. I know we have dozens of vacancies, particularly in the side of the county. I have lots of communities asking for additional foot patrol officers, and investigative units and other things in Burtonsville, White Oak, Silver Spring, you name it. How is the morale of our police now? What reaction do you have to this proposal, and how will the morale be? What impact will today's vote have on police morale?
Well, I believe morale is an all-time low in our department right now. There's a lot being asked of our members to do, especially during this pandemic, and they feel that without any sort of support of increases, as I've shown in packets before, our starting pay is one of the lowest in the region, and they don't feel that there's support there. And if we give no increases or no benefits increases, I think morale's going to be even lower. You're going to see people leave, maybe for other departments, and I think it's a shame.
Is our starting pay still 5th out of 6 in the area?
Out of the D.C. area, yes, we're 5th out of 6 in starting pay.
How do we?
Out of the Baltimore, Washington area, it's about 10th out of 13th, with Baltimore City and other areas higher than us.
So I know we've all become familiar with so many assistant chiefs and high-ranking lieutenants that have left for our own Park Police or Laurel or Rockville or other nearby jurisdictions that might provide a little less action and better compensation. So that's the case with the rank and file as well, is what you're saying.
Yes, absolutely. Especially if no service increments are funded. That's nothing for them, and they can go other places to make more money with the experience that they have gained here in Montgomery County.
Is Mr. Wren here from the county employees? Mr. Wren?
Mr. Wren?
Ms. Millar?
I see Mr. Wren's name on, and he just... Yeah.
I'm here.
Okay.
I've never known you to be shy before. Okay. Can I ask you the same question about morale among this council's discussed in detail the dozens of vacancies we have among school nurses that are providing critical mental health support for our most vulnerable children, our bus drivers that we routinely lose to WMATA because they pay, I think, $300,000 more in the course of a career. Can you talk about the morale of our school nurses and others and how they'll be impacted by today's votes?
Thank you, Councilmember Hucker. Let me just preface my comments by acknowledging that this is a unprecedented and enormous challenge for all of us, including the council, the executive, the union leadership, and the workforce that's continuing to provide critical services during this pandemic. Our hope is that we could all move forward together in partnership to maintain the confidence and commitment of these courageous women and men, but also effectively get on the other side of a very challenging and unknown fiscal situation that we find ourselves in. But let me be very clear in answering your question. In our most acute services, public transportation, public safety, public health, and in those categories, I'm including ride-on drivers. I'm including crime lab analysts who go out and gather the evidence and what have you to be able to effectively prosecute the bad guys. School health nurses who have become primary health care givers to a growing population of our community, to the 911 dispatchers where we have an all-time crisis where we can't hire 50 people. Think about that a minute. There are 50 people down in 911. I hope we never suffer the public safety disaster that is presents us, and we can hire again, but nonetheless it exists. All through our union, the morale is, I can't even begin to describe it. It's below zero. Our attrition rate in Montgomery County is around 20%. That is the absolute highest in the nation, one of the highest in the nation when you back out compared to places like Detroit and other jurisdictions that can't pay their bills, so people leave because they can't expect their wages to continue. It's certainly the highest in the region. That speaks volumes to how low morale is. Volumes. As soon as someone lines up another job, they're gone. We're losing child care, protective service, social workers to jurisdictions like Frederick and alike that pay $10,000 less just to get out of Montgomery County. They can't afford to live here because their wages do not allow that. They can't handle the ever-growing workloads that they're faced with. They are not keeping pace with managing to take care of their families, feed their families, send their families to college, and we still haven't gotten full payment for even an increment, a deferred increment yet. So we're still 2.75% behind on increments to us. And now we're talking about potentially disrupting their wage scales that have a to the grave impact on them because it will reduce the retirement benefit. And you want them to continue to put themselves in harm's way and contract a virus that could potentially kill them. And we have lost a member to the virus. And we're talking about not supporting them with giving them what they are due and promised. We've sent sessions on the general wage adjustments. My workers are not overly paid. The average salary in my union in the service, labor, and trades is about $50,000. In the other union, the OPT union, that includes highly degreed positions, the average wage is only $65,000. These folks are struggling every day. And yes, morale is rock bottom. And we're going to lose people in droves once this pandemic is behind us and they have other opportunities to pursue.
Thank you. Last question, I guess, for Mr. Madalino, and then I will turn it back to you, Mr. President. I think others have questions, and then hopefully we can.
We do. We have many questions.
Remarks at the end. But Mr. Madalino, if retention, which we've been dealing with for years, worsens, and our recruitment challenges mount, which we have, we have severe challenges already faced, filling a fire class, filling a police class year after year under the best of circumstances, when people aren't putting themselves, they're just running into a fire. They're not running into a fire and exposing themselves to a lethal virus at the same time. What will be the impact on our mandatory overtime costs that we also struggle with year after year?
Well, thank you very much, Councilmember Hucker. The fire department does have a challenge with overtime and unbudgeted overtime, and that is being driven by both the cost of training paramedics, which is paid for out of overtime, and we're trying to fix by creating those 20 paramedic trainee positions to try to solve that problem and reduce overtime. But certainly, if you have more vacancies and we have a hard time filling the academy slots, and that say we have to delay the academy because of social physical distancing, you can't have all these people training and being on top of each other for whatever for corrections, for fire, for police, for sheriffs, all of those things. We plan to actually spend more money in overtime. So, one of the ideas, and the county executive strongly supports this, and you've heard it from the various representatives from the labor groups, because the need to keep up morale, because these positions are essential to restarting the economy. When we talk about testing and contact tracing, but having the overall public safety system working is essential for us to get back into a functioning economy and to get revenues back to some sort of semblance of normal or a new normal. So these are critical positions that are essential to the entire community. So you are correct. Having especially in the public safety positions, because it's slightly different than just hiring someone off the street because of what is required of them, that a loss of any of those public safety positions across all three unions just creates the demand for more overtime and the demand for more spending. Mr. Wren was very, I think, on target when he was talking about the challenges of the 911 call center and the vacancies there, and why the county executive strongly believes in the provision of a better retirement benefit for them, like other public safety workers, and better working conditions for them, and a recognition of the incredible work that they do on behalf of the residents of the county, especially when we're facing an enormous health challenge.
Right. Those all have mandatory overtime requirements, staffing requirements, and I don't know if you've calculated how much it will cost us based on any assumptions you could make about if you have increased, diminished retention, diminished recruitment, how much it will cost us in overtime costs. But that would be helpful to know what the sort of false savings we think we're achieving by if these contracts are rejected. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Mr. Trumka, I know that you were trying to answer. Did you have some thoughts that you wanted to clarify?
Yeah, just in response to Mr. Madaleno's comment about the relationship between increments, steps, and the overall cost of the budget. I think what's important to understand is that there are many factors that affect compensation costs. Things like pay increases, GWA's step increases, health and retirement costs, lapse, the churn that Mr. Madaleno mentioned, and they're all really contribute, but they're independent factors. The cost of a increment is indisputably quantifiable, and it's included in the executive's budget. When you look at the cost reduction from churn, as Mr. Madaleno calls it, that offsets it. But what in fact what he's doing is he's saying that we have one independent cost savings from the churn, and we want to take credit for that to say that the increments have no cost. In fact, they do have a cost. It's just that there are other cost factors, all one independent of each other, that create the entire compensation cost. And so if you look at them independently, you'll see that the absence of a step reduces costs. The presence of a step increases costs. Independent of that, there are many other factors, but it's important to segment those to understand their different effects. To say that the increment has no cost, that's contrary to all the data that OMB gives us.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Rice.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. In lines with what we have continuously said since the beginning, I'd like to move to reject all provisions listed in the decision chart.
Second. Moved by Councilmember Rice. Is there a second?
Second.
And seconded by Councilmember Reamer. Councilmember Giwando.
Thank you, Mr. President. I won't be supporting the motion. I'll say that up front. I think it's worth reminding my colleagues what's at stake here and what's important. You heard some of it. We often say budgets are moral documents, deciding who we collect our tax revenue from and how we're going to spend it. Where we put public money is a signal of what we believe is important and who we believe is important. I believe that it's important, not only important, it's a critical priority that we recognize the people whose jobs require them to expose themselves not only to danger in the normal circumstances, as has been mentioned, but to a virus and their families, to a virus during a deadly pandemic for which there's no vaccine no widely available testing, and no assurance of a full recovery. I'm talking about the police officers, the EMTs, the fire and rescue personnel who protect our county residents every day. But I'm also talking about the bus drivers, the janitors, the corrections officers, and who also work and support our county residents, and who just by the simple act of showing up put themselves and their families at risk. Think about this bus driver or the nurse who's on the front line of testing, or the EMT who responds to a medical crisis on your home or in your street. I'm glad that they're getting hazard pay. I know we've discussed that because they deserve it. But it's only for 6 pay periods. And I'm also glad that it's largely reimbursable from FEMA and through the CARES Act. It's not going to cost us anything. So when that point is brought up, you need to consider that. There's 2 ways to seek reimbursement for that money, which they deserve. Then let's think about what we've told our unions and our employees. Last week, we asked them to go back and negotiate and to reopen their contracts in an act of good faith, and they did it. They knew the writing was on the wall. They know our tax revenue is at risk and businesses are shut down. We have record unemployment. They understand that. But they agreed and came back with significant cuts with their second offer. Back on May 5th, we said we wouldn't forget them. We said we would continue to negotiate. We actually said this isn't a rejection. I said that and others said that we were not outright rejecting their contracts. I heard and they heard that we were going to try to work together. I heard and they heard that we were not going to turn our backs on our workers, the very people who are putting themselves at incredible risk every day, because we know they're essential to our public service and to our county and to our residents. They went back to the negotiating table and agreed to changes. And now we're considering a motion that says we don't care what you did, nothing, we're not going to do anything, and maybe we'll come back. And that's not good enough. 0 across the board is not fair. And it's certainly not what we said to them when we sent them back to the negotiating table on May 5th. I found out since then that in Prince George's County, it's been used that other jurisdictions are not funding contracts, that they're for their libraries. They have a different contract system and different laws. I'm the lead for libraries here. Their library contracts have been funded, wage adjustment and increment. And because their law is different, they have not rejected or closed the door on negotiating. They just pushed it down the road in the case of police. They're allowed to push down to the fall to when they negotiate. I believe that we should be able to preserve the number of jobs covered by these agreements while providing some elements of what the unions are seeking, and where they're trying to have the experience of their workers reimbursed and exposing themselves every day. This contract contains equipment and clothing, shoes, reimbursements for things that they need to do their jobs. We can come back, as always, and discuss cost savings. The executive consent savings plans, which I'm sure he will, depending on how this revenue situation turns out. If I was one of these represented workers, I'd rather have furlough days than missing the increments that are due to my service of Montgomery County. I worked in the federal government. I've said this before. Increments are not in question. You move up the pay scale because you accrue experience that directly benefits Montgomery County residents. As was mentioned by Councilmember Hucker and the union heads, we have a crisis in hiring of our frontline police, firefighters, and nurses. If we do not at least remain in the ballpark of compensation, we will fail to recruit, and county residents will get less service and will be less safe. And now everyone knows I've been vocal about how we consider policing and how we need to have more accountability and transparency. One way we don't get there is by undercutting our applicant pool. And if we don't support the steps and keep those salaries up where they need to be to get qualified, highly trained, competent officers. Right now, we're asking our personnel to stretch beyond what their job should be. And we're going to make a hiring crisis even worse at a time when we don't need to. And we're going to demoralize our workers and add an accelerant to this crisis. This is a missed opportunity if we take this vote today. And we're putting at risk the functioning of essential services provided by a safe, healthy, and economically secure and valued workforce. This is an unprecedented time. The unions came back with an unprecedented offer. I'm disappointed that we're not taking it at face value. Let me end with this. Working people organize for better working conditions and more security for themselves and for the people they work alongside with. For labor unions, that's a belief that our economy works better for everyone when we work together. And I think we're forgetting that here. Tell that to the $50,000 a year police officer or bus driver who can't afford to live in Montgomery County, that we can't afford some sort of increase to recognize the extraordinary service that they're doing. We've spent a lot of money, rightly so, through necessary supplemental and appropriations to make sure that we're keeping folks safe here in Montgomery County. We have a healthy reserve, over $500 million. Over $500 million. We just saw 4 or 5 recommendations from the executive that came in today, a little late, I'll say to Rich, that should have come in earlier, but came in today as far as operating expenses and other ways that we can save the money or some of the money to fund some of these contracts and send the message to our employees that we value them. So we can afford this. We certainly can afford it in FY21, and then we can, going forward, people know that things might change. But we need to send that message now and recognize the hard work that our men and women are putting in right now. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you, Council President. This has certainly been a robust discussion, a serious discussion, one that's very important for us to have. I feel like we need to understand the moment that we're in. I think that this is a serious situation. This council has had to step up, as we talked about quite a bit yesterday, to respond and react to what I consider to be the most flagrantly irresponsible budget that has been presented. And unfortunately, the county executive has put us in a deeply difficult and uncomfortable position. And I think he's done this council no favors. I think he's done our public sector employees no favors, and I think he's done no favors. And that is the context with which we have to take up this decision today, and that we have had to take up this entire budget, as was mentioned. I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can.
Where did you lose me?
Well, not too many minutes ago. Maybe maybe a sentence or two back. Yeah.
Well, I was mentioning the fact that I think that the county executive proposed what I consider to be the most flagrantly irresponsible budget.
We heard that
has been proposed in the county, one that was not balanced and one that we legally could not pass, with negative appropriations, with questionable recalculations, without transparency and accountability, and without a recognition at any point following the crafting of that budget of the moment that we were in. And he, in so doing, has forced this council to make extremely difficult decisions throughout this entire process, many of which we talked about yesterday. And I think this council has stepped up in making those difficult choices that the county executive has refused to make up to this point. And unfortunately, that has put us in a position where the county executive has done no favors to our public employees, has done no favors to this council and the deliberations that we have had to make without the opportunity and benefit of cost-saving measures and a strategy in order to achieve those cost savings. And certainly no favors to the public, most importantly, to transparently and accountably determine how we provide public services to residents who need them at a time when they need them the most, and to provide some level of certainty and consistency and stability at a time when they are understandably anxious based on a public health emergency and a resulting economic crisis. Mr. Madalena, I wanted to ask you about this savings plan that or it's not even really a savings plan, it's more like an outline of some savings ideas I appreciate that they've finally come forward. We've been asking for them for 10 weeks. And I'm just curious, when was the plan developed?
We've been talking about this internally for a while. There was a sense of, the county executive made a proposal with his budget. He stood by his proposal. You took different actions about the school system, recognizing the situation you're in, recognizing your inherent rights as the legislative branch. So we've been talking about various iterations of this. We were trying to have this all after we understood what budget you wanted to authorize and enact this year. But in order to potentially make it a little more confident for all of you to support these incredibly important compensation agreements, that we thought now was the time to provide some explanation of the thinking that we're doing. We've been having conversations with you, with the council and the council staff about the federal funds that we already have coming in the door, the additional federal funds that will be going after, from FEMA reimbursements to other grants.
I appreciate that. So that this was developed this morning or last night, or this was developed prior to that?
This has been under consideration for a while. Our timing was moved up to try to make sure that we could demonstrate and hopefully encourage you to agree to these revised agreements, considering the unions took almost 75% of the cost of the contracts off the table. That here was an additional step to provide you with the ability to move forward with the revised contracts, to provide our employees who are essential to dealing with this crisis with the same degree of support, stability, and predictability that you just so eloquently talked about other parts of the community needing at this crisis moment.
I appreciate that, but I think that this being viewed as an additional step, I think the council has been asking for this as an initial step, and we've been asking for 10 weeks, and it's pretty disappointing that the morning before we take up the last major consequential decisions of this budget, with as much as at stake is now, that we are being provided what is charitably an outline of some ideas that you've come up with. We specifically talked yesterday about savings plans, and none of these items were mentioned. Could you speak to that? You were specifically asked very directly, and there was no suggestion that you were planning on sending something specifically over today. There was no suggestion that these had been talking. So if you had been deliberating, then is there a reason why that wasn't shared with us yesterday?
Thank you. So the charter, to be clear, does give you 17 more days to pass the budget. So tomorrow is not the last day for you to take a vote. It is the last day that you have decided. Like the same thing with the contracts. We sped up the renegotiations to put them in order to meet your deadlines, and not the deadlines that are contained in the law for the time frame that we have to renegotiate. So we are all adjusting to calendars and meeting artificial deadlines back and forth.
Well, I would point out. Thank you for that. I would point out that the major decisions about the budget like this, cutting $43 million from the Public Health Benefits Trust, obligations that we have that will cost more down the road, 5% operating cuts to services at a time when they're needed the most, cutting of 100 vacancies. These are very valid proposals, but they are ones that we had decided, because we have heard nothing from the executive branch with any level of seriousness or substance on savings, that we would be picking up in the next fiscal year.
You were very clear at wanting a continuity of services budget. We were fine with that framework and moving forward and working through that. And then coming back once we had a better understanding of the revenues, as I said yesterday, with a set of savings plans for FY21 if they are needed. The bill that came into the U.S. House of Representatives yesterday afternoon, in fact, in an initial calculation on my part, shows that we would receive an additional, should that pass, an additional $600 million in federal assistance.
Mr. Madaleno, just quickly here, true or false, if you can answer, is the executive branch pursuing, for the first time in its history, a line of credit based on the understanding that should revenue shortfalls reach the $600 million level, as has been projected by members of the finance staff along with council staff, that the county could run out of money as early as this time next year? True or false? False? Why is that false? You're not pursuing line of credit?
That's not the question you asked. Are we pursuing a line of credit? Yes.
What is it on the basis of? We don't need the money?
It's to make sure, in the extremely rare case that if there were a cash flow issue because of what you well know is the schedule of disbursements, we do not collect the income tax. The state does. We get them on set schedules. If we have to pay bills while, 2 weeks before the February distribution or the November distribution, you have, in essence, a credit card. And as any consumer knows, in these sorts of situations, you would want that credit card in hand and not be applying for it at the register because you don't know if you're going to get it and what the rates are going to be. This is a best practice. This is not at all, and you can ask Mr. Covey, this is not at all an action being taken because we are concerned about liquidity. This is a backup insurance plan, as you would want a smart organization to have in its back pocket.
I appreciate that. I talked at length with Mr. Covey, and I know my colleagues in the Government Operations and Fiscal Policy Committee has as well. And I agree that it's a prudent action, but it's a prudent action that's based on the serious and unprecedented fiscal climate that we were in, the fiscal climate that the council has taken all of the actions throughout this budget process. I think that to come forward with a savings plan at this point and base a decision based on a savings plan that hasn't been considered or fully vetted, and very well likely will be needed to take up the second part of this decision, which is to address the likely revenue shortfalls that we've already discussed, is really important. And the comment made before of the inherent rights of the council, I don't believe that the council or anybody in public office has inherent rights to hold office. I think that we have responsibilities that are provided to us by the public, and I think that the council has taken those responsibilities in this climate extremely seriously, and I think that we need to move forward with the process that we set forth and take the mantle of making these very difficult decisions based on the fact that we have not received anything of substance and savings and planning for those savings until just a few moments ago.
And I would say the executive also has taken these responsibilities very seriously, and just because his approach and decision-making is not yours does not make it any less credible or appropriate.
Okay. You're complete. You're finished, Mr. Friedson, Councilmember Friedson. Thank you. Councilmember Albornoz.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. President. I do have some questions, but I want to provide a little bit of context on where I'm at right now and my thinking through all of this. And I was dreading having to be in this place again. I guess for context, the Department of Labor recently reported that 14 million people in our country have filed for unemployment. At the height of the Great Recession 10 years ago, it was 9 million, and it's 21 million for the Great Depression. In Montgomery County, more than 60,000 people to date, just to date, have filed for unemployment. one of the most Googled terms right now is bankruptcy. And we know that it's likely the stay-at-home order, which I completely concur with, will need to be extended, as the county executive has mentioned, unique to our region rather than what's happening at the state, for a longer period of time. And we just recently read that the city of Los Angeles is extending their stay-at-home order until July. And so there will be hundreds of businesses that are probably going to fail, because despite the efforts of the federal government and despite all of our efforts here in Montgomery County to help shore up and support particularly our small local businesses, they're not going to be able to continue to move forward. And so, as Mr. Madaleno mentioned yesterday, and I really appreciated the acknowledgement that, you know, what lies before us. Obviously, there are a lot of unknowns, but we know that it is going to be particularly bad. And I actually do appreciate that we have received notification with regards to a savings plan. I think that will be obviously a first step, but it's hard to wrap your brain around the fiscal impact and what's going to be happening moving forward. The real estate numbers for the month of March look terrible. The real estate numbers for the month of April are probably going to be worse. And as we enter into the busiest season within the real estate market, I don't anticipate that it's going to improve significantly from March and April. And so our sources of revenue are drying up at rates that are incredible. I mean, we've got about 4% occupancy right now within our hotels. And so none of that revenue is coming in either. And we also know that the people that have filed for unemployment are the people whom can file for unemployment, but we have thousands of county residents who are contributing to our economy in every way imaginable, who can't file for those unemployment benefits by virtue of their status here in our country. And to the county executive's credit, we're trying to specifically address the needs and keep many of those families from falling off the cliff entirely. And so, and we are just at the beginning of beginning to process and think through what the fiscal implications are going to be in the upcoming year. And so with that context, it does bring me back, and I've said this before, but it does bring me back to 10 years ago, to the worst day in my professional life, when I had to walk into room 300 on the third floor of the county's recreation administrative headquarters, and for 4 hours, with each category of position that we had within the department, and at that time we had more than 187 full-time employees, that 68 of those employees were going to be notified by me that day with an OHR representative and a representative of the union that they were going to be going through a reduction in force process. And I will never forget the tears. I will never forget the emotion. I will never forget the pain on the faces of the people. In some instances, people who were just 2 or 3 years away from retirement. In some instances, people whom had just gotten married and had just been hired by the county, but because they were the most recently hired, were the first to be ripped. And thank goodness that through a variety of efforts, we were able to find placements for all the people that wanted them. But at that time, we didn't know that. And so it was a horrific situation, and ingrained in me wanting to make sure that we absolutely never go through that again. And so while I completely understand and respect the positions of our unions, and they are doing their jobs, and Lord knows they do them well, because we have been able to compensate at a rate higher than a number of other jurisdictions historically over time. We know that those employees have stepped up in really heroic ways, but I'm also reticent to put us in a position to make it even more difficult when we know what's coming will come and have to make those difficult decisions. And anything that we can do now, as we have done with the budget to date, and showed great restraint in everything that we put back, and what we did put back have directly related to COVID, I think we need to show restraint here now, because I don't want to be in a position where between now and FY22 and into FY22, as savings plans come and as the picture becomes clear of the historical nature of the recession that's about to come upon us, that has already started, that we're going to have to go through that reduction in force process again. And so I'm also uncomfortable, however, with not advancing anything moving forward, because the two options of all or nothing are not any place any of us would like to be right now. And so I did have a couple of questions with regards to, if this contract is rejected today, then Mr. Drummer, what happens next?
Well, you would go ahead and adopt a budget. There's no money appropriated for the wages and benefit increases that are listed in the renegotiated agreements. And the council on its own, or the executive and the council together, through a supplemental appropriation or a special appropriation, could come back later and provide certain benefits if the financial picture changes. It's easier to go that way than it is to go the other way. If you approve them, it's harder to take them back, especially the increments, because some of the employees would have already gotten them. And then you're in a position of furloughs or layoffs. But this would be the decision. If you go ahead and reject these provisions, that would be the way the budget goes forward, and it would require a supplemental appropriation or a special appropriation during the year to actually put some money for county employees' increases.
Okay, thank you for that. And then while I appreciate and respect the effort to defer most of the funding within FY21, with the bigger hit coming in FY22, but as we've acknowledged, and Mr. Madaleno, you said yesterday that FY22 is probably not going to be any better than FY21 and could in fact be worse. And I remember vividly one of the contracts that was in place at the time, which from a perception was perceived to have been broken, because there was a feeling at that time that we couldn't afford that contract fiscally. But there was great pain and consternation at that time as well. In fact, significantly so, to the point where there were protests and understandably great frustration when that contract was in fact not honored, because it was not able to stand fiscally at that time. And so there's going to be pain no matter which way you cut it. And the question is, for me, what can we do to mitigate and help bring down some of that pain? And unfortunately, it seems clear to me that as difficult as it is to take steps now, I think it's important for us to do that, to put us in a better position later. And the morale issues, which I very much respect, they've been in place for a while. And I will also note that it's hard to take blood from a turnip. Any of the fat that existed within our departments was eliminated a long time ago. And so when we cut, and even if it's at 5%, you are talking about programs. You are talking about what departments will have to do, which is to keep positions vacant, to not be able to move forward critical programs and services, and in some cases that are going to need to be expanded to meet the demand. And just stating a 5% cut across the board is actually extraordinarily difficult for departments to be able to absorb without impacting personnel, because so much of operating budgets within departments is made in personnel. So I'm struggling with this significantly, but I do err on the side of wanting to make a difficult decision now so that it makes it easier for us moving forward when even more difficult decisions are going to have to be made. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. I'm going to jump in. We have other speakers as well, but I did want to say that I personally feel horrible that we have to make this decision now. I do. It was my hope all along that we make this decision when we knew our economic situation, not an estimate, but what our future would bring to us. And continuity of service was our goal from FY21 budget, and we're working towards meeting that goal. This means that there was going to be no new programs, no innovation, and to discuss pay or benefit increases at some time in the future. The FY22 budget may very well be the most difficult we may be faced with the untenable position of not being able to even reach a continuity of services budget for next year. We have that issue in front of us. Our fiscal situation is extremely tenuous right now, and there are too many unknowns at this point for us to be able to fund this contract that we're presented to us today. This is not about what our employees deserve. This is about what the county can afford. Our employees are fabulous. This is about trying our very best to avoid layoffs or furloughs, to continue to provide services that are so very necessary to all of our residents, and to be able to go above and beyond for those in our community whose livelihoods have been erased. We are facing challenges right now, the likes of which we have never faced before, and hopefully we will never face again. We must confront this new reality with the most equitable response possible. Our response must be to work with what we have, not what we would like to have or what we would hope to have. These are the incredible difficult decisions that we must make now to ensure that when we do come out of this, and we will, we do so in the strongest possible position for the greatest number of people. I want to be clear. I will support the motion, but I want to be clear that we come back when we have economic fact rather than economic theory. We all have to remember what we're doing. And with that, Councilmember Reamer.
Thank you. I don't have anything to add. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Vice President Hucker. You're on mute, Tom. There you go.
Thank you. Yeah, to your last point, Mr. President, I think that's the approach of this contract in a way that there are no significant costs. There's actually a reduction in FY21, and we all know we're going to be talking about this before the end of the contract. But what I want to say is, in many ways, this whole crisis has brought us closer together and united all of us, and really the whole county, around the response to COVID. It's all we're doing. It's all we're talking about, is helping our residents do everything we can, despite the horrible human toll, to stay as safe as we can and to respond to the economic crisis as well. And we need to keep that in mind in this discussion. We all know you get what you pay for. Most of you are, texting right now on an iPhone or a Droid and not on a burner phone, because we all know quality matters, not just savings. And our government workers are called on right now to deliver critical services, whether they're driving sick people to the ER, whether they're driving beleaguered workers on ride-on bus to work, whether they're providing mental health services to our most vulnerable school children that are under incredible stress right now, or seniors that are facing lots of isolation, or whether they're doing what they do under the best of circumstances, literally stopping violent crime by putting their bodies on the line, or putting out fires. Our workforce is the best asset we have during a crisis, and they're on the front lines performing the essential services, and that can't just be a slogan. Many of them are terrified of getting this virus. Many of them do not want to go to work. Many of them would love to be sitting on a Zoom call rather than driving a bus or out being a social worker treating sick patients. But in fact, they have to go to work because we said they're essential workers. Well, that can't just be a slogan. That's a responsibility we put on them. It's also a responsibility on us to treat them like they're essential and to value them and to pay them like they're essential. President Eisenhower, who knew a lot about operations, said morale is the greatest single factor in success. This is the man who ran D-Day. And our morale has suffered for years in Montgomery County. And we've had hours and hours of briefings about how to address this. Well, our morale, you heard earlier today, is at rock bottom from the very people we're counting on to keep us all safe. We have to avoid exacerbating the unacceptably high levels of turnover we already have among our school nurses, among our firefighters, among our police. Since the emergency began, I've been very proud of the work we've been able to do collectively. We've cut $70 million from a county executive's budget that was created before the crisis started. We've also made significant new investment in a whole line of critical services. We have said yes to grants for nonprofits. We've said yes to millions of dollars for food aid. We've said yes to millions of dollars for our hospitals. We've said yes to money for our hotels. We've said yes to money for our nursing homes. We've said yes to tens of millions of dollars in grants to businesses, big and small. And I've enthusiastically supported every one of those programs and every one of those votes. This is no time we're going to now turn around and say no to our firefighters and our EMTs and our nurses and our social workers that are on the front lines after giving out all these grants to businesses and nonprofits and hospitals and hotels and nursing homes. That makes no sense to me. Our employees are stressed all the time. On top of the heavy workloads they already had, they're dealing with paying their rent. They have spouses who have lost jobs. Many are dealing with unexpected child care responsibilities and family care responsibilities. We have firefighters in quarantine right now. And they're in quarantine not because they have symptoms, but because they were exposed to other firefighters who have symptoms and are in quarantine. And why were they exposed? Not on the fire truck. They were exposed because they have to live together. And why do they have to live together? Because we don't pay them enough to live in Montgomery County on their own. That's who we're talking about right now. Again, if they're essential workers, that's a responsibility we have too, not just them, to act like they're essential. Protecting those who are engaged in this response has to be our first priority. This is the biggest public health emergency in a century. Public service workers are the ones who are going to get us through this, and they're working round the clock right now to meet the overwhelming demand. We can't ask them, as we do every single year, to just do more with less. That's like a slogan without any actual values behind it. There are lives at stake, and we have to support them and give them the resources to allow them to do their jobs and to stay on the job and not to quit for other jurisdictions. So finally, let's not forget that much of the funding we've received, not just the $183 million from the feds that can go to public safety work and can go to our healthcare workers, but the $30 million we weren't even expecting for Ride-On, which far exceeds the amount of money we're talking about in these contracts. We got $30 million we weren't even expecting, specifically for Ride-On to keep that service up and running. That far outweighs what we're talking about today. And we all know, if you watch the news, as was said earlier, there's more federal money on the way. So let's not act like the sky is falling more than we don't know what the future looks like, but we don't need to predetermine it by throwing oil on the dumpster fire we have now that is our employee morale. So that's why I'm very, very concerned, as we heard today, what happens when we get sick, when my family members get sick, when my neighbors get sick, and we don't have enough people to answer a 911 call. We have 50 vacancies on 911 right now. Our residents should be very nervous about where this is all headed. So I hope you all do the right thing, support our workers. This is no time we should be supporting our nurses, our EMTs, and our firefighters, and not punishing them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Rice.
You know, it's interesting. When I hear this rhetoric around how we're hurting and harming and how we need to protect, how about the protection for the people who don't have jobs? How about the protection for the 35,000 that have filed for unemployment here in Montgomery County? How about them? How about my wife, who is unemployed, who still hasn't had a single dollar touch her bank account? How about them? How about we talk about what we're going to do for them versus talking about how we're going to do pay raises in addition while people are struggling to put food on their damn tables? I just don't get it. Where have we gone to where we're saying that raises are more important than people trying to save their livelihoods? There are people out there that are struggling right now, who are at wit's end. There are people who are committing domestic violence, not just because they have issues mentally, but also are pushed to the brink and have nothing else to do and have no other recourse. But yet we're going to fight here and talk about raises in a time when people are struggling to figure out what tomorrow means for them, to figure out what they're going to do. All of the money that we put on the table was to help level set them. It was to try and give them some semblance of normalcy, to save their lives. This was not about saying that we were doing more. We're not bailing out businesses. We're saving people. That's what we did when we did all of these supplementals. When I commented on us yesterday and talked about us coming together, this is the exact opposite of that right now. We should be lifting each other up for the great work that we've done, not trying to criticize and tear it apart by saying, well, it doesn't justify this. That is not who we are. That is not what we fought for. We voted to cut $40.7 million out of Montgomery County Public Schools. We did that. We voted to have a maintenance of effort budget. The Montgomery College was coming in tens of millions of dollars over where they were, justifiably. We didn't do that. They automatically said, you know what, we're going to be team players and go with a maintenance of effort budget. We have cut tremendous amounts of money out of this budget. And to make it seem as though then we have this huge amount of money that's coming from the federal government that's going to take care of all our woes. Well, if that's the case, why is the county executive proposing a savings plan? You can't have both sides. You can't have one that says, oh, okay, everything's going to be fine. We've got this new federal dollars. I heard Mr. Madaleno. Oh, yeah, we've got this other federal money that's coming in. Well, then why in the hell are we proposing a savings plan? If the savior of the federal government is going to come down and lift us up and cover all the expenses we have, we don't need to do a savings plan. So I'm very interested to hear the conversation about how Mr. Madaleno is going to defend a savings plan coming from the county executive when he just told us that, hey, there's tons of money coming from the federal government. It doesn't make sense. We know that there are tough decisions ahead. I've been there. I've had to vote to rebase the school system. I've had to vote when we knew we had folks that were picketing outside our houses because of the cuts that we had to make during the recession. I've done that. I've raised my hand and known what that impact is going to be. And Gabe was on the other side in the department telling those same people crying in his office about the decisions that had to be made. I walked into this in 2010 with that facing me right in my face. That was the first decision I had to make. So I can tell you, we don't want to have those kinds of things before us again. By voting to do this allows for us to try and minimize as much of those tough decisions that Councilmember Alvarez talked about as possible. I just want to close by saying one thing. I want you to talk to a person who's been out of work for 10 weeks now, who doesn't have a job, and explain to them how we want to increase salary, and see what they say. Ask them, because I have. And the response I've gotten is that why would you do that instead of making sure that you can help the folks who don't have any money coming in at all? That's the response. That's why I made this motion. That's why I support it. I think that, again, we know that we're going to have to come back to this. Everything that Council President Katz said, I completely agree with. We're going to have to come back to this, especially with the fact of the savings plan. And I'm going to fight tooth and nail to make sure that every single hour and every single position is protected. Let me be very clear to my union partners. That is my objective, is to make sure that the same paychecks you got will be the same paychecks you continue to receive. I don't want to see any jobs cut. I don't want to see any hours lost. That is my objective. So let me be clear. In a time in which we see people who don't have that luxury, who don't have the luxury right now to be fighting about an increase, are the people who I'm thinking about right now. But know that I have not forgotten about you as well. And I appreciate all the dedication and commitment that you have made. I also appreciate all the dedication and commitment that some of our folks who are working in our community, like our grocery store workers, our frontline employees in our healthcare fields, like my mother-in-law who's a nurse at Holy Cross Hospital, who isn't getting hazard pay, who's on the front lines. These are the kinds of things that, again, we have to all take in context. This isn't an us versus them. This isn't one versus another. This is taking all of these things in context and trying to make the best decision possible and how to move us forward positively. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Councilmember Glass.
Thank you, Mr. President. I didn't realize the queue had been so long, but I appreciate hearing everybody speak. Last year, my first piece of legislation was to ensure pay equity within our workforce, because our workforce deserves to be compensated fairly and justly. That's why it was my first piece of legislation. And today, many of those individuals are on the front lines, we know, keeping our county functioning, from the health and human services staff to our bus operators and correction officers and emergency responders. Each of them are essential staff putting themselves and their families on the line to help keep our community humming along. And these contracts, they include compensation adjustments, but they also include provisions for clothing and equipment. And for our frontline personnel during this challenging time, we know that that is a life and death issue, making sure that everybody has the equipment and clothing necessary to stop the spread of this virus. And as has been noted, we also know that there are morale issues within certain areas of county government. And these are really important factors for me. It's hard to ignore what our workforce is doing. But it's also hard to ignore some of the economic realities that we're operating in. And one of my guiding lights right now is to be able to maintain our workforce and to ensure that they all still have jobs and can continue providing for their families, and which means we don't have layoffs and we don't have furloughs. And for all of our county employees who are raising families or planning for retirement, who need to remain employed, that weighs heavily on me, especially at a time of record unemployment among our constituents. And so what makes this conversation for me even harder is that we received these revised contracts yesterday, not allowing us to have any time to think about it or talk about it other than what you're hearing now. And for everybody who's watching, this is it. For contracts we got a little more than 12 hours ago, which I think is a disservice to this process. And because we haven't had much time to talk about this, I have a question for Mr. Drummer. I'm not sure if it was asked earlier, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there a way that within these contracts we can stipulate that aspects of them be based on future revenue and future revenue projections?
No, you have to pass a budget. I think, the contracts can say what they want, but you have to pass a budget that's definite, one way or the other. You're either funding something or you're not. It can't be funding if something happens. It's you're either putting the money up or you're not.
And so what were you, if you could reiterate your comments earlier then about supplemental?
Well, that's something the council can always add to the budget through a supplemental appropriation or a special appropriation, depending on the circumstances and who initiates it. You can add something to the budget during the year. We've done that with all of the grants that we've just appropriated money. That's all money that was added to the FY20 budget during the year. That can be done at any time during the year. You have to find the resources. Obviously, if the circumstances change and the revenues are up, you would have the money to do it. And the executive could propose it, or you can do it, council can do it on its own to fund one or more provisions in this agreement. At the time, it's difficult to fund. Well, you could probably fund even the steps, and you could do retroactive funding for it. But but that would be totally up to the council at the time. Special appropriation would require 6 votes.
Sure, and I appreciate you explaining that because again I think that we shouldn't prematurely shut the entire door at this point in time, but because it's important to recognize what continues to be done. But the context in the economic reality cannot be separated. And so as I understand what you just said, to synthesize it, no aspects of the contract can be stipulated upon for the future. They're ironclad, but the council can come back, the county can come back, and as the economic reality becomes more clear, we can add or supplement to whatever the contracts are.
Yep.
Okay.
You could appropriate money for increases for employees or to fund any particular item here later on during the year. Yes.
Okay. That makes me feel better about this situation, again, having listened to my colleagues and being able to hear where they are. For me to know that this isn't a finite in terms of this conversation. I would like to revisit this conversation. I know there's lots of conversations regarding the budget and the fiscal reality that we will be having, and probably having them quite soon. But thank you for the context, and I'll say that is where I'd like to go. Understanding that clearly a majority are not in support of the contracts and the ironclad nature of the contracts. I don't want this conversation to end. I understand, again, where we are in this situation, in this pandemic, but I think that there are some really important points that were made in support of our workforce and the work that they continue to do to allow us to do our business and to allow everybody else to try and remain healthy and safe by putting themselves on the line. So thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And I think that was what I was attempting to say as well. You might have said it better, clearer than I did, but that's where I am. I would like to revisit this when we really do know what we're doing. Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, Mr. President. Unfortunately, I appreciate your comments, the comments of my colleagues. But the motion on the table here does shut the door. It shuts the door on every provision in the contract. And I want to be clear that we have the authority to fund certain provisions that have an economic impact and not fund others. This all or nothing is not what we have to do. That's what's being proposed. That's the motion before you. But that's not what we have to do. I just want to make sure that the public understands that, because I think that's been ambiguous. Mr. Drummer, could you confirm that as our council attorney, that we have the authority to pick and choose or reduce things that have fiscal impact in these proposed contracts?
Yes, that's correct. You can pick and choose.
Great. The other question I have, this would be to you and maybe Aaron on our staff, Mr. Trumpka. How much, if we were to give a 1% general wage adjustment, what would that cost?
I have that data. It'll take me 2 or 3 minutes to get to you, and I'll get that soon.
Sure. All right. Well, just if you could check, I'll come back to you. I have other questions. I think one of the things that overarching is a challenge here is that we're taking this all or nothing approach, and we're creating a false choice, a false dichotomy. I'm hearing things like, well, what about the unemployed worker? We're all here for the unemployed worker. What have we been doing over the past 6 weeks, if not to help the unemployed worker or the small business? If someone has a domestic violence claim, I sat in on the 3D, 4D at 8 a.m. earlier this week on the crime statistics. Thankfully, they're actually going down. And as far as domestic violence, but it is an issue. We have car thefts and gun violence going up in those districts. But who do you think's responding to those cases? And what mental health issues are they dealing with? It's the $50,000 a year, lowest 5 of 6 in the region, police officer who's responding to that case. Who do you think is providing the cash assistance that we've appropriated to the unemployed, undocumented worker? It's an HHS staffer who's covered under this contract. You cannot separate them and create that false choice. And to do so is not fair. We need to do both things at the same time. The other point, while Mr. Trump is doing the data, the idea, 1, we can pick and choose. 2, we shouldn't be separating. The idea that this amount of money, whatever we set it at, whether it be a 1% GWA or an increment or at the full amount, the idea that even the full amount of $30 million annualized, but under this contract, it's much less in FY21. That was going to be my other question. How much would this contract cost in FY21, please, as presented?
$30 million.
In FY21?
Oh, in FY21. In FY21, I think it was about 12 to 13.
Okay.
For all the contracts.
Thank you. The idea that is going to lead to, if we fund $12 million this year or $30 million next year, or somewhere in between that, because again, we can pick and choose, the idea that directly is going to cause furloughs and layoffs is not intellectually honest. Mr. Trumpka, how much is our reserves?
I don't have the reserve number there. I'll
tell you, it's over $532 billion. Million dollars, excuse me. I wish it was billion. Over $532 million. Over half a billion. We just heard we're getting $30 million in DOT ride-on money. We have $183 million from the federal government. We're submitting all hazard pay and many other expenses to FEMA. So the idea that if you fund anything, you have furloughs, that's not an intellectually honest argument. I understand. I don't want anyone furloughed. I don't want anyone riffed. I think, again, the employees that we're talking about would prefer their increment and their acknowledgement and their value now, and then have to deal with what happens down the road. I think even if that was a choice, they would. But to act like that is the only option is not the only option. Let's set it at 1%. Do you have the number yet, Mr. Trump?
Yes. So for county government-wide tax supported, if it were to start in July 1, it would be $5.9 million for
FY21.
For FY21, $5.9 million, 1% to all county government employees starting July 1.
Okay. So to give a 1% general wage adjustment, $5.9 million. Again, not going to result in layoffs. So if you want to take this action, take the action. But I don't think it's fair to pit people against each other, to act like if you fund anything, it's all or nothing, and it's layoffs or nothing. That's not intellectually honest. The last question I have. last point I want to make, rather. Furlough versus value. Should we send a message that we value our employees, which we all do? This is a way to do it. So I would ask Mr. Rice, the motion maker, would you accept a 1% general wage adjustment as an amendment to your motion?
Mr. Duwando, in light of the fact that you talk about intellectual honesty and question my honesty, no, I'm not accepting any amendment to my motion.
Well, I'm sorry you're making it personal. I'm just telling you the argument. I'm not making it about you.
You said it. It was your words, Mr. Duwando.
Okay. So that's not going to be accepted. We're going to choose to not fund 200. I'm sorry, it's not $200. We're going to not fund in this projection a $200 increase in the boot subsidy, so that our employees that need to have better shoes to do their job are not going to get it. We're going to not fund a food benefit increase from $10 to $15, so that you can, as you're working and out there on the front lines and you need to pick up food, we don't want it to go $5 extra. Those are the things we're projecting, along with many other things in this contract, and we don't have to do that. But that's the motion before you. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is really unfortunate because, as I will reiterate, on April 24th, when Council President Katz and myself spoke to the executive, we're relaying the need and the opportunity to address this particular budget process in a way that would help us prepare for what may be coming. And the idea was, can we address this contract as a continuity of operations, understanding that there would have to be legal frameworks considered, and then come back later when we had an opportunity to understand where we are fiscally, to then revisit something like this. And it would have been wonderful if that would have been the approach and the agreed upon way of proceeding, because this conversation is just so unfortunate to not recognize that we're in the middle of a pandemic. It's a global pandemic. It's not even like the recession that we faced in 2009, 10, 11. We have no idea. Nobody has any idea. We may start to open and then have to close all over again. We have no clue what is occurring. And so to use the same old talking points and the same script over and over again in the middle of a global pandemic, it's incredible to me. The Latina mom that owns her home and has been so proud and has 3 children and has applied for unemployment, applied on March 3rd and still hasn't received anything. This is like a real situation for so many people. And so to start pitting one against the other is just so bizarre to me. Our responsibility here is to figure out how can we best position the county to right this. And the conflicting messages have not helped. For Mr. Madaleno to say when we passed that resolution that I introduced, to say that it might be optimistic to think that we could actually afford a continuity of operations budget, but then now we're being told that somehow everything is just wonderful. It's just incredible. So it's totally disappointing that here we are in the middle of a pandemic when we have a responsibility to our residents, who many for the first time ever have found themselves in dire straits, having to figure out how to ask for assistance. For me, it's a sense of pride that our employees do have these jobs. It's a sense of pride that we can act quickly to position ourselves in solid footing so we would not have to face any decisions like we had to face during the other recession. And so, again, at least from my perspective, and I said this time and time again, my goal here was for us to be able to be responsive, pass the continuity of operations budget with regards to the negotiated agreements, basically say we can't at this point consider increases because we don't know what we're going to be facing. We have these artificial deadlines. We don't know when we're going to start opening. Could it be in Will we know in September? Will we know in October? We're not really sure, but there will be a time certain when at least I'm hoping we can say, okay, this is where we are. And then rethink this. We can pass supplementals. We can look at different ways. But this weird conversation, it's just very, very sad to me that here we are hitting everybody, using political talking points and things like that, when so many people are dying right here in Montgomery County right now in this particular moment, when so many people are going to be losing their homes, when so many people have no idea what their life will be because they happen to be undocumented and have very little options. And so, it is what it is. I get it. I understand. But as far as I'm concerned, the appropriate thing and the responsible thing to do is to take a pause so that we can figure out where we're going to be and then come back at a time certain to revisit some of these things. But let's not just create this false dichotomy and call each other intellectually dishonest. I've been here for a long time. I've never seen anything like this before. There is a sense of being collegial and respecting the institution that is what holds this county council together. And I've never been in a situation where we're like doing this type of thing, when at the end of the day, we're trying to care and respect and support all of our residents, including our employees. So I will vote for this motion, and I will add my name to those who believe that we should, at a point certain, come back and revisit when we have a clear picture of our fiscal situation. Not in this moment where it seems like there's all these conflicting reports and interpretations of where we are. I don't feel comfortable that I know where we are in terms of our fiscal situation right now. So that's where I'm going to be.
Thank you. Thank you, Vice President Hooker.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was going to move to separate the motions.
The move to separate the motion. When you're saying that, Councilmember Hooker, do you mean by
3 separate votes? I also have a question about where we are with the volunteers, Mr. President.
Okay.
They were part of this at first, and then they were sort of taken out. But I've lost track of where they are and why they're not on the agenda as well.
Well, it is. Mr. Drummer, did you want to answer that one, please?
Yeah, the collective bargaining law is different for the volunteers. There's no provision for 9 days to renegotiate, and they haven't come. They could have renegotiated an agreement, but they didn't. Apparently, they haven't. Nothing has come over from the executive on the volunteers to renegotiate that agreement. So you're still at the place you were last time. They're not on the agenda today because there's nothing that was sent over. Okay. That's where the volunteers are.
Thank you. I mean, maybe the staff can look into this, but I know I'm confused because they believe they have 9 days to renegotiate as well.
Well, I've looked at it. There's nothing in their law that gives them the 9 days to renegotiate. But I mean, the council would certainly be in a position to look at a revised collective bargaining agreement with the volunteers, but nothing has come over here. And that's why they're not really in the same legal position as the unions.
Right. Okay. Well, if we're about to exacerbate our retention problems with our professional firefighters, I'd prefer not to do it with the volunteers at the same time. So with that, Mr. President, I would move to separate the motion into 3 votes, please.
Second.
Who did the second? Councilmember Givondo? It's been
Mr.
moved.
President, parliamentary procedure, we already have a motion that's on the floor.
Yeah, that could be a motion to amend the motion, I suppose, that's on the floor, but you would need to get a majority vote to do that.
Okay. Is that what you're asking, Vice President Hooker?
I am. Thank you.
And Councilmember Givondo, you're in agreement with that. So we're going to need a majority vote to separate the motions. All those in favor of this motion, please raise your hand. Councilmember Givondo, Councilmember Hooker. All those opposed, please raise your hand. And that is everyone else, so that fails 2-7. Next, did you have anything else, Vice President Hucker?
No, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. And I did want to mention about for the volunteers for the I on several occasions asked the county executive to inform them of, or to at least notify them that they were having discussions, and to my knowledge, they never were notified. So it was the county executive side that made those decisions. It wasn't our decision. It would be in the discussions, and that's my understanding. Councilmember Friedson.
Yeah, I just wanted to share. I'm disappointed and share the disappointment that has been expressed earlier about some of the directions that this conversation has gone in. I continue to believe that this council has stepped up in extraordinary ways in an unprecedented moment to address a crisis, one that we've already seen 7,283 people contract this global pandemic. We have 386 residents who have died of this disease. We have 1,550 people in our hospitals, 978 people in acute care, 572 residents currently in intensive care fighting for their lives. And I just think that we, and I'll include myself in this, need to reflect the moment that we're in and understand that this isn't just an economic crisis that we face, and these aren't just fiscal decisions that we make. This is a moment in time that requires really serious, really sober decision making. And I don't think that the last minute savings plan that we got at 9:48 in the morning reflected that. I don't think that some of the comments here reflect that. There was a comment about false choices. We didn't make the false choice here. The false choice was made by suggesting that a 5% reduction in operating costs of things like health and human services should fund contracts, which is just inappropriate. It's just not something that we've ever done. And there was a suggestion about how we should compare the supplemental appropriations that we've done in an unprecedented manner. This council stepping up should be the deliberative branch of government, should be the reactive branch of government in a crisis, has been the proactive branch of government. And I'm proud of working with each and every one of you to take the actions that we've taken to prop up the social safety net, to make sure that people who are hungry can eat, as our schools have to be closed based on the fact that it is dangerous for children to be outside of their homes and for parents to be outside of their homes. The fact that businesses are shuttering their doors, which provide the wages that allow people to eat and allow people to live, and that we have stepped up to fill in those gaps. The surge capacity, $10 million that we've provided to those efforts, the $10 million that we've provided for cash assistance to families in crisis, to go in a comparison of pitting one against the other is really disturbing to me, and I think it really does a disservice to this conversation and to this body that has worked really collegially and collaboratively to get to the point that we have, and to really step up to provide the leadership that this county has desperately needed in a time of crisis. And I just think it's really important that we reflect on that. And I just wanted to lastly say about the reserves. We've heard a lot about this. We've heard a lot about the federal funding, the $183 million that has come to us, that we have already begun the collaborative conversations of figuring out how to invest those funds. That is not to create new programs, new spending, or to provide new compensation. That money is specifically to address the existential crisis, the unprecedented public health emergency that we are in, and the added cost that this government and local governments around the country have had to incur as a result. The additional money for transit, for ride-on, while I think it is terrific, and we are grateful and appreciative of it, it is so that we don't have to drastically cut routes, while the funds that are normally paid for ride-on to use it are drastically reduced. The same reason why WMATA, our Metro service, is getting $800 million. It's because we have, by design, by intentionality, to save people's lives, asked people, demanded of people, required people not to use our public transit system, but recognize that we need to have a functioning public transit system now for our essential employees with proper social distancing requirements and moving forward. And if we don't have the support that we have received thus far, we would not have a public transit system when we get out of this. Metro would not function as we know it, and the ride-on system would not exist as we have and our residents have come to rely on it. When it comes to reserves, our reserves are not here as a savings account to spend to provide new programs or new compensation. It is provided based on the tremendous work of the prior council that was continued by this council to insist upon the fact that after the Great Recession, we realized that we need to have emergency reserves in case of drastic revenue shortfalls. The exact moment that we are now facing, those reserves are for, not for new spending, but to brace against revenue shortfalls. The ones that we now realize that the reserves may not be enough, and the unprecedented action that we heard earlier is being undertaken in a prudent and thoughtful and measured approach by the staff in the Department of Finance who initiated that, as they should have done, doing their jobs, as we appreciate that they are doing, because we need them now more than ever in these challenging and uncertain times economically and fiscally, to take out $300 million in a line of credit to make sure that we can brace for what could be the worst. We have an obligation to the public to hope for the best and to provide that level of optimism, but to base our decisions by preparing for the worst. And that's what this conversation must be about. That's what those decisions are about. That's what our reserves are for. That's what the federal funding is for. That's what the line of credit is for. That's what all of the tough decisions that we've made to cut serious services, including, as we heard earlier by the education chair, over $40 million from our education system. That wasn't because we don't think that those are valued. This isn't a question of what we value. It's a question of what we can afford, and putting ourselves in a position where we can fiscally, responsibly, and sustainably be able to weather a storm that has begun and we don't know how long it will go. And that's what this is. It is about making sure that we can get through this. And if we are going to get through this, we're going to have to get through it together by being sober, by being thoughtful, by being measured. And I hope that the decision we make today and the continued decisions that we make moving forward on this budget and as we move forward will reflect that reality, as I believe it has, and this council has shown from the very beginning of this budget process.
Thank you very much. I have no other speakers. We have a motion by Councilmember Rice, a second by Councilmember Reamer. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And that is Councilmember Albornoz, Councilmember Reamer, Councilmember Glass, Councilmember Friedson, Councilmember Navarro, and Councilmember Rice, and Councilmember Katz. All those opposed, Councilmember Giwando and Vice President Hucker. The measure passes 7-2. And it's now my understanding, and Mr. Drummer, please make certain I'm saying this correctly, we need a motion for the compensation and benefits for the non-represented employees as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, the budget has, the budget as recommended originally had the same general wage adjustment in steps and changes to the retirement plan for non-represented, for the GRIP and the RSP. So you need to make a final decision on that, on the compensation and benefits for non-represented.
Thank you. Is there a motion?
I move that we mirror the decision that we just made for our represented employees.
Second.
And the motion was made by Councilmember Navarro, seconded by Councilmember Reamer. I see no speakers. Let me double check that. I see no speakers. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And that is Councilmember Albornoz, Councilmember Reamer, Councilmember Glass, Councilmember Friedson, Councilmember Navarro, Councilmember Rice. Those opposed, Councilmember Hucker, Vice President Hucker. Councilmember Giwando, are you voting on this measure? and Councilmember Juando. This passes 7-2 as well. Thank you very much. And with that, unless Ms. Michelson or Mr. Drummer have anything else, we're going to call a recess. Ms. Michelson or Mr. Drummer, is there anything else?
No, Mr. President, you can call a recess.
Very good. Thank you. We're calling a recess. We will be back at 1:30 to discuss community grants and MCG cost sharing. Thank you very much. We are in recess.